Take a moment and picture yourself stepping outside tonight. You flip a switch, lock a door, maybe set an alarm. Your home stays exactly where you left it, solid and permanent, waiting for your return. But 22,000 years ago, there was no switch to flip, no door to lock, no walls that promised to stand through winter. There was only you, your family, and the vast, unpredictable world stretching endlessly in every direction. Tonight, we're going back, way back, to a time when shelter wasn't something you owned, but something you created, abandoned, and recreated with nothing but your hands, your knowledge, and whatever the landscape offered. This is the story of how our ancestors survived the ice, the wind, and the darkness using nothing more than ingenuity and an unshakable will to endure. Whether you're listening to fall asleep, focus while working, or just let your mind wander somewhere ancient and wild, you're in exactly the right place. This is the first part of a journey that will take us from the depths of caves to the first permanent camps, from desperate survival to the birth of home itself. And if this slow dive into deep history helps you escape the noise of the modern world, a like and subscribe would mean everything. So dim the lights, settle in, and let's walk backward through time to a world where every sunset brought the same question: where will we sleep tonight? The year is 20,000 before the Common Era. The world is colder than you can imagine, locked in the grip of the last glacial maximum. Massive ice sheets stretch across continents like frozen oceans, trapping so much water that sea levels sit 400 feet lower than today. What we now call England is connected to France by a bridge of land. You could walk from Asia to Alaska without getting your feet wet. And scattered across this harsh, beautiful world are small bands of humans, maybe 30 or 40 people at most, carrying everything they own and searching for one thing above all others, a place to make it through the night. But here's what's remarkable about this moment in human history. These weren't desperate, fumbling survivors, barely clinging to existence. These were master engineers of survival, people who had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of reading landscapes, predicting weather, and turning the raw materials of nature into sophisticated shelters that could mean the difference between life and death. They understood something we've almost forgotten. That shelter isn't just about walls and a roof. It's about relationship. A relationship with wind patterns, with the movement of animals, with the subtle signals that tell you where water flows underground and where the ground stays dry when the rains come. They could look at a hillside and see not just dirt and rocks, but a complete ecosystem of possibilities. And they had to be right, because unlike us, they couldn't just drive to the hardware store if their shelter failed. They couldn't call for help if the wind tore their walls apart. They had one chance to get it right every single time, or they didn't get another chance at all. So what did shelter actually look like in this frozen world? Well, it depended entirely on where you were and what the land offered. In the mammoth steppes of what's now Ukraine and Russia, people discovered something extraordinary. The bones of massive woolly mammoths, scattered across the landscape like ancient construction materials, could be transformed into some of the most sophisticated shelters the world had ever seen. These weren't crude bone piles, these were architectural marvels. Picture this: a circular foundation made from mammoth skulls, each one carefully positioned to create a stable base. Then, massive thigh bones and tusks, some weighing hundreds of pounds, arranged in precise patterns to form walls that could withstand hurricane-force winds. The spaces between the bones were packed with smaller bones, stones, and earth, creating an insulation system that could keep the interior warm, even when the outside temperature dropped far below zero. But here's the genius part. These mammoth bone houses weren't built by individuals. They required coordination, planning, and collective effort on a scale that challenges everything we thought we knew about Ice Age society. Moving a single mammoth skull required multiple people. Positioning the tusks needed engineering knowledge passed down through generations. And the final structure, when complete, could house an entire extended family for months at a time. At Medjugorje, in what's now Ukraine, archaeologists have uncovered the remains of mammoth bone houses that were occupied repeatedly over hundreds of years. The same spots used again and again, with evidence of repairs, renovations, and improvements. These weren't temporary shelters, they were the beginnings of something we might almost call architecture. But mammoth bones weren't available everywhere. In the forests of northern Europe, people developed an entirely different approach. They became masters of wood, hide, and the subtle art of reading trees. They could look at a grove of birch or pine and see not just timber, but a complete shelter system waiting to be unlocked. The process began with selection. Not every tree would work. They needed straight trunks for the frame, flexible branches for binding, bark that could be peeled in large sheets for waterproofing. They understood which trees bent without breaking, which ones shed water naturally, and which ones could be shaped by fire without losing their strength. The construction itself was a dance of precision and adaptation. Long poles were driven into the ground in carefully planned patterns, then bent and lashed together to create dome-shaped frames that could flex with the wind instead of fighting it. Over this skeleton, they layered materials in a specific order. First, a framework of smaller branches, then sheets of bark, then animal hides, and finally, in the coldest regions, even layers of earth and snow for insulation. But perhaps the most ingenious feature of these woodland shelters was their modularity. Unlike the mammoth bone houses, which were essentially permanent structures, these forest shelters could be partially disassembled and moved. The wooden framework might be left in place, but the coverings, the most valuable and labour-intensive parts, could be packed up and carried to the next camp. This flexibility was crucial because these weren't sedentary people. They followed the rhythms of the seasons, the movements of animals, the availability of plants and water. Their shelters had to match that rhythm, appearing and disappearing across the landscape like flowers that bloomed and faded with the changing world. And then there were the caves, not the crude, bear-infested holes popular imagination often conjures, but carefully selected, methodically prepared spaces that offered natural protection enhanced by human ingenuity. The people of Ice Age Europe understood caves better than any real estate agent understands location. They knew which caves stayed dry, which ones had good ventilation, which ones offered easy escape routes if predators appeared. More importantly, they knew how to improve them. They built stone walls to divide large cave spaces into rooms. They dug drainage channels to keep water from pooling. They created sophisticated hearth systems that maximized heat while minimizing smoke. Some caves show evidence of continuous occupation for thousands of years, with layer upon layer of improvements, modifications, and innovations. At Cro-Magnon sites across France and Spain, we find caves that weren't just shelters, but community centres, places where multiple families gathered, where tools were made and repaired, where children learned the skills they'd need to survive, and where the long winter nights were filled with stories, music, and the creation of the world's first great art. But here's what's truly extraordinary about all of these shelter systems. They weren't just about physical protection. They were about creating human space in an inhuman world. Every shelter, whether made from mammoth bones, wooden poles, or enhanced cave walls, was designed around the central organizing principle of Ice Age life. The hearth, the fire, wasn't just a heat source, it was the heart of the shelter, the point around which everything else revolved. The entire structure was built to optimize the fire's warmth, to channel its smoke safely away, and to create spaces where people could gather around its light. The fire was safety, warmth, cooking, light, and community, all rolled into one flickering, essential presence. And around that fire, something remarkable happened. People didn't just survive, they thrived. They told stories, they made music, they created tools of astonishing sophistication, and they developed the complex social bonds that would eventually carry our species to every corner of the planet. These shelters were humanity's first great engineering achievement, not because they were the biggest or the most permanent, but because they were perfectly adapted to their purpose, keeping human beings alive and human in a world that seemed designed to extinguish both life and humanity. But shelter in the Ice Age wasn't just about the structures themselves. It was about the knowledge systems that made them possible, the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned through trial and error, success and catastrophic failure, which materials worked where, when, and why. This knowledge wasn't written down. It couldn't be Googled or looked up in a manual. It lived in memory, in practiced hands, in eyes that could read the landscape like a book. It was passed from parent to child, from expert to apprentice, through demonstration, repetition, and the kind of deep learning that only comes when your life depends on getting it right. And that knowledge was vast. It included understanding of weather patterns that could predict storms days in advance, knowledge of animal behavior that could tell you when predators were near, mastery of materials that let you turn raw wood, bone, and hide into structures that could withstand forces that would destroy modern buildings. But perhaps most importantly, it included the social knowledge of how to organize the labor, coordinate the effort, and make the collective decisions that turned individual survival instincts into community shelter systems that could protect entire groups through the harshest conditions on Earth. This was the foundation, the base layer of human achievement that everything else would eventually build upon. Because you can't have agriculture without shelter. You can't have cities without the knowledge of how to create protected spaces. You can't have civilization without first mastering the fundamental challenge of staying alive when the world around you is trying to kill you. And our Ice Age ancestors didn't just master that challenge. They turned it into an art form. They created shelters that were efficient, beautiful, and perfectly suited to their nomadic way of life. They proved that humans could thrive anywhere, under any conditions, as long as they had the knowledge, the cooperation, and the will to adapt. But this is just the beginning of the story. Because as the ice began to retreat and the world began to warm, everything was about to change. The retreating ice didn't announce itself with fanfare. There was no moment when the world suddenly became warmer, no grand melting that swept across continents in a matter of years. Instead, what happened around 15,000 years ago was a slow, almost imperceptible shift. Winters that lasted just a little less long, springs that arrived just a few days earlier, rivers that ran just a bit fuller when the snow melted. But for people whose entire lives revolved around reading the subtle signals of the natural world, these tiny changes were as obvious as sirens. The mammoths were moving, the reindeer herds were shifting their migration routes, plants were growing in places they'd never grown before, and for the first time in thousands of years, the descendants of those mammoth bone house builders had to ask themselves a question their ancestors never faced. What do you do when the world you've perfectly adapted to starts disappearing? The answer, as it turned out, would reshape not just how humans built shelter, but how they thought about home itself. As the ice sheets retreated northward, they left behind a completely transformed landscape. Where there had once been frozen tundra, there were now vast grasslands. Where there had been scattered groves of hardy trees, there were now dense forests stretching to the horizon. And where there had been predictable patterns of animal movement that people had followed for millennia, there was now chaos, opportunity, and unprecedented abundance. The mammoth bone houses that had served so well during the deepest cold suddenly seemed less practical. Mammoth populations were declining as the steppes they depended on gave way to forests, and the new landscape offered materials that hadn't been available before. Vast stands of timber, new types of stone, different clays and soils that could be shaped and moulded in ways the Ice Age builders had never imagined. But more importantly, the changing climate was creating something that had been rare during the height of the Ice Age: predictable abundance. Rivers that flowed year-round, nut groves that produced reliable harvests, seasonal migrations of fish and waterfowl that arrived like clockwork every spring and fall. For the first time in human history, some groups began to consider a radical idea. What if we didn't have to move constantly? What if we could stay in one place for months or even years at a time? This shift in thinking led to the first great revolution in shelter construction since the mammoth bone houses. People began building not just for immediate survival, but for extended occupation. They started thinking about comfort, convenience, and permanence in ways their Ice Age ancestors never could have afforded. In the river valleys of northern Europe, archaeologists have found evidence of structures that represent a completely new approach to human habitation. These weren't the portable, flexible shelters of the Ice Age nomads. They were semi-permanent constructions designed to house people through multiple seasons, with specialized areas for different activities and storage systems that could preserve food and materials for months at a time. The most remarkable of these early post-glacial shelters were found at sites like Starkar in northern England and Hohenwicheln in northern Germany. These structures show evidence of careful planning and construction techniques that would have been impossible during the Ice Age. They were built in locations that had been carefully selected for access to multiple resources: fresh water, good hunting, abundant plant foods, and materials for construction and tool making. But what made these shelters truly revolutionary wasn't their size or permanence. It was their specialization. For the first time, we see evidence of structures that weren't just generic living spaces, but buildings designed for specific purposes. There were sleeping areas that were separate from cooking areas, storage spaces that were designed to keep food dry and safe from animals, work areas where tools were made and repaired, positioned to take advantage of the best light and ventilation. This specialization required a completely different way of thinking about space and human activity. Instead of the single, multi-purpose rooms of Ice Age shelters, these post-glacial builders created what we might recognize as the first true floor plans. Spaces that were designed around human behavior rather than just human survival. The construction techniques evolved as well. Where Ice Age builders had worked primarily with the materials immediately at hand, these new builders began to transport materials over significant distances. They would carry specially selected stones from quarries miles away. They would fell trees in distant forests and drag the timber back to their construction sites. They were investing time and energy in their shelters in ways that would have been unthinkable for nomadic Ice Age peoples. And they were experimenting. At site after site across post-glacial Europe, we find evidence of builders trying new techniques, testing different materials, and gradually developing more sophisticated construction methods. They learned to dig post holes to specific depths for maximum stability. They developed new ways of joining wooden beams that didn't require metal fasteners. They created waterproofing systems using combinations of clay, plant fibers, and animal fats that could keep interiors dry through the wettest seasons. But perhaps most importantly, they began to build not just for themselves, but for their communities. These weren't individual family shelters scattered randomly across the landscape. They were clustered settlements where multiple families lived in proximity, sharing resources and coordinating their activities in ways that required new forms of social organization. At Lepenski Vir, along the Danube River, in what's now Serbia, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of one of the most sophisticated early settlements in Europe. Dating to around 9,500 years ago, this site shows a level of planning and organization that represents a complete departure from Ice Age settlement patterns. The houses at Lepenski Vir weren't just randomly placed. They were arranged in a careful geometric pattern along the riverbank, with each house positioned to take advantage of specific environmental features while maintaining clear sightlines to neighbouring structures. The buildings themselves were trapezoidal in shape, with stone foundations and sophisticated hearth systems that included stone-lined fire pits and carefully designed ventilation. But what makes Lepenski Vir truly remarkable isn't just the sophistication of individual buildings, it's the evidence of community-level planning and coordination. The settlement includes shared spaces for communal activities, specialized structures that may have served religious or ceremonial functions, and a complex system of paths and clearings that connected the individual houses into a cohesive whole. This wasn't just a collection of families who happened to live near each other. This was a planned community, designed and built by people who were thinking not just about their immediate needs, but about how human groups could live together more effectively and efficiently, and they were thinking about the future. Unlike the Ice Age builders who constructed shelters that could be abandoned at a moment's notice, the builders of Lepenski Vir were creating structures designed to last. They were investing in permanence, betting that the resources and advantages of their chosen location would continue to be available for years or even decades to come. But this shift toward permanence came with new challenges. When you're nomadic, waste isn't a problem because you leave it behind when you move. When you're settled, you have to figure out how to manage the accumulation of garbage, human waste, and other byproducts of daily life. The builders of these early settlements had to become sanitation engineers, developing systems for waste disposal that wouldn't contaminate their water sources or attract dangerous scavengers. They also had to think about defense in new ways. Nomadic groups could escape threats by moving. Settled communities had to find ways to protect their investments in permanent structures. This led to the development of the first fortifications, earthworks, palisades, and other defensive features that could protect entire communities from human and animal threats. But perhaps the most significant challenge was social. When people live together in permanent settlements, they have to develop new ways of resolving conflicts, making decisions, and organizing collective activities. The informal leadership structures that worked for small nomadic bands weren't sufficient for managing the complex social dynamics of settled communities. This led to the emergence of new forms of social organization, new kinds of leadership roles, and new systems for managing shared resources and coordinating group activities. The archaeological evidence suggests that these early settlements were experimenting with different approaches to community governance, trying to figure out how human groups could live together peacefully and productively in permanent locations. And they were largely successful. Many of these early settlements were occupied continuously for hundreds or even thousands of years, with evidence of gradual expansion, improvement, and adaptation over multiple generations. They represent humanity's first successful experiments with permanent habitation, the foundation upon which all subsequent human settlements would be built. But they also represent something deeper, a fundamental shift in how humans thought about their relationship with the landscape. For Ice Age peoples, the landscape was something you moved through, something you adapted to but never tried to control. For the builders of these early settlements, the landscape became something you could modify, improve, and shape to better serve human needs. This was the beginning of a transformation that would eventually lead to agriculture, cities, and all the complex civilizations that followed. But it started here, in these modest riverside settlements, with people who dared to imagine that humans could create permanent places in the world, places that would endure long after their builders had returned to the earth that had given them everything they needed to survive. The revolution was quiet, built from timber and stone and the accumulated wisdom of generations who had learned to read the world around them like a familiar story. But its consequences would echo through every human settlement that followed, from the first farming villages to the great cities of the ancient world, to the suburbs and skyscrapers we call home today. They built these places to last, but they also built them to change. And that might be the most remarkable thing about these early settled communities. They understood that permanence didn't mean rigidity. At sites across post-glacial Europe, we find evidence of structures that were continuously modified, expanded, and adapted over decades or even centuries of occupation. The builders of Lepenski Vir didn't just construct houses and walk away. They returned year after year, season after season, adding new rooms, improving existing structures, and gradually transforming their settlement into something that grew organically with their changing needs. Floors were rebuilt multiple times, each new layer incorporating lessons learned from the previous version. Hearths were repositioned as families discovered better ways to manage smoke and heat. Storage areas were expanded as people learned to preserve larger quantities of food and materials. This wasn't random renovation, this was systematic improvement, driven by generations of people who were thinking not just about their own immediate comfort, but about the long-term viability of their community. They were creating places that could evolve, structures that could adapt to changing circumstances, while maintaining their essential function as human habitats. But perhaps the most profound change wasn't in the buildings themselves, but in what these buildings represented. For the first time in human history, people were creating spaces that existed independently of their creators. Ice Age shelters lived and died with the people who built them. When the band moved on, the shelter was abandoned, left to decay back into the landscape from which it had emerged. But these new permanent structures had their own existence, their own history, their own identity separate from any individual family or group. This shift created entirely new categories of human experience. For the first time, people could return to places they had known as children and find them still standing, still recognizable, still home. They could see the work of their ancestors, preserved in stone and timber, could touch walls that had been built by their grandparents' hands. They could inhabit spaces that held memory, that carried the accumulated experience of multiple generations within their carefully crafted walls. And they began to treat these places differently. Archaeological evidence shows that the inhabitants of these early settlements developed elaborate rituals around their buildings. They buried special objects in foundation deposits as if they were making offerings to ensure the structure's longevity. They painted symbols on walls and carved decorative elements into support posts, transforming utilitarian buildings into expressions of identity and belief. Most remarkably, they began burying their dead within and around their settlements, creating permanent connections between the living and the deceased that would have been impossible in nomadic societies. At Lepenski Vir, human remains are found throughout the settlement, sometimes beneath house floors, sometimes in dedicated burial areas, but always in close proximity to the places where daily life unfolded. This wasn't just about honouring the dead, it was about creating continuity, about establishing links between past, present, and future that were anchored in physical space rather than just in memory and oral tradition. The dead became part of the architecture, their presence woven into the very foundations of community life. But this revolution in permanence came with unexpected costs. As people invested more time and energy in their settlements, they became more vulnerable to catastrophic loss. A fire that destroyed an Ice Age shelter was an inconvenience. The materials could be replaced and a new shelter built within days, but a fire that destroyed a permanent settlement represented the loss of years, or even decades of accumulated work and investment. Archaeological evidence from this period shows increasing concern with fire prevention and control. Houses were spaced farther apart to prevent fires from spreading. Hearths were surrounded by elaborate stone constructions designed to contain sparks and embers. Special areas were designated for activities that involved open flames, keeping dangerous work away from the main living spaces. They also had to develop new strategies for dealing with structural failure. When a nomadic shelter collapsed, you simply built another one. When a permanent building began to fail, you faced a choice. Invest the time and resources necessary for major repairs, or abandon years of work and start over somewhere else. The archaeological record shows that these early builders chose repair and renovation far more often than abandonment, suggesting that they had developed sophisticated techniques for maintaining and extending the life of their structures. But the most significant challenge was social. Permanent settlements created new forms of inequality that had been impossible in nomadic societies. When everyone owns only what they can carry, wealth differences are necessarily limited. But when people can accumulate possessions, invest in improvements to their living spaces, and pass property down through generations, inequality becomes not just possible, but inevitable. At sites across post-glacial Europe, we begin to see evidence of social stratification that mirrors differences in housing quality and location. Some houses are larger, better constructed, and positioned in more advantageous spots within the settlement. Some burials contain more grave goods, suggesting that the deceased had access to greater resources during their lifetimes. Some areas of settlements show evidence of specialized craft production, indicating that certain individuals or families had developed expertise that gave them economic advantages over their neighbors. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Specialization allowed communities to develop more sophisticated technologies and more efficient production methods. The potter could focus on perfecting ceramic techniques, while the toolmaker concentrated on improving stone and bone implements. The result was a rapid acceleration in technological innovation that would have been impossible when everyone had to be a generalist capable of producing everything their family needed. But it also created new tensions. When resources were abundant and everyone's basic needs were met, differences in wealth and status might be manageable. But when resources became scarce, when harvests failed or game became hard to find, these differences could become sources of conflicts that threatened the stability of entire communities. The archaeological evidence suggests that the inhabitants of these early settlements developed increasingly sophisticated mechanisms for managing these tensions. They created communal spaces where everyone could gather, regardless of their individual wealth or status. They established ritual practices that emphasized community solidarity over individual achievement. They developed systems for redistributing resources that helped ensure that no one fell too far behind, even when their own efforts weren't sufficient to meet their needs. But they also began to experiment with leadership structures that went beyond the informal influence systems of nomadic bands. At larger settlements, we find evidence of individuals who seem to have held special roles in community decision-making. People whose houses were larger and more centrally located, whose burials contained symbols of authority or special status. This wasn't necessarily the emergence of kings or chiefs in the way we might understand those roles, but it was the beginning of formalized leadership, the development of social institutions that could coordinate the activities of larger and more complex communities than had ever existed before. And these communities were growing as the climate continued to warm and resources became more abundant. Settlements expanded both in size and in number. What had begun as small experiments in permanence became networks of interconnected villages, each specializing in different resources or activities, each contributing to a regional economy that was far more complex and productive than anything that had existed during the Ice Age. Trade networks developed that could move materials and finished goods across hundreds of miles. Obsidian from volcanic regions appeared in settlements far from any natural source. Seashells from coastal areas found their way into inland communities. Specialized tools and decorative objects were exchanged between groups that might never have direct contact, but were connected through chains of intermediary settlements. This was the birth of something we might recognize as civilization. Complex societies based on permanent settlements, specialized production, social stratification, and long-distance exchange networks. It emerged not through conquest or the imposition of authority from above, but through the gradual evolution of communities that had learned to live together in permanent places. But it was also fragile. These early experiments in settled life were vulnerable to environmental changes, social conflicts, and the simple challenge of maintaining complex systems over long periods of time. Many settlements were abandoned after years or decades of occupation. Others survived for centuries before succumbing to internal tensions or external pressures. The ones that survived were those that managed to balance permanence with adaptability, stability with innovation, individual achievement with community solidarity. They were the ones that learned to build not just better houses, but better societies, communities that could grow and change while maintaining their essential character as places where humans could live together successfully. And they were building something else, something that might be even more important than their houses or their tools or their trade networks. They were building the idea of home itself, not just as a physical shelter, but as a concept, a feeling, a sense of belonging to a place that existed independently of any individual's presence there. This was perhaps their greatest innovation, the transformation of shelter from a temporary necessity into a permanent foundation for human life. They created places that could outlast their creators, communities that could welcome new members while maintaining their identity, homes that could serve as launching points for exploration and expansion rather than just refuges from the dangers of the world. But even as they built these remarkable permanent settlements, they never completely abandoned the skills and knowledge that had served their nomadic ancestors so well. They remained masters of temporary construction, capable of building effective shelters quickly when they needed to travel or establish seasonal camps. They maintained their deep understanding of natural materials and environmental conditions. They preserved the flexibility and adaptability that had allowed humans to survive and thrive in every environment on Earth. What they had done was add permanence to their toolkit without sacrificing mobility. They had learned to build both temporary and permanent structures to create both portable shelters and lasting homes. They had become architects of human space in all its forms, masters of the full spectrum of possibilities that lay between the nomadic tent and the permanent house. And they were just getting started, because as their settlements grew larger and more complex, as their trade networks expanded and their technologies advanced, they would face new challenges that would require even more sophisticated solutions. They would need to learn to build not just houses, but entire cities, not just communities, but civilizations. But that's a story for another time. For now, it's enough to marvel at what they had already accomplished, the transformation of human shelter from a temporary necessity into a permanent foundation for civilization itself. They had solved the fundamental challenge of creating lasting human spaces in a world that seemed designed to erase all traces of human presence. They had built the first true homes, and in doing so, they had changed what it meant to be human. But permanence brought its own mysteries, because as these post-glacial communities grew more sophisticated, as their buildings became more elaborate and their settlements more complex, something unexpected began to happen. They started disappearing, not all at once, not dramatically. But across Europe, archaeologists have found site after site where thriving permanent settlements were simply abandoned. Houses that had been occupied for generations were left to decay. Carefully constructed hearths went cold. Storage areas that had been meticulously maintained were emptied and never refilled. At first, researchers assumed these abandonments were caused by external pressures, climate change, perhaps, or conflicts with neighbouring groups. But as more sites were excavated and more carefully analysed, a different pattern emerged. These weren't communities fleeing disaster. These were people making choices, deliberate decisions to leave behind everything they had built and return to older, more familiar ways of life. At Hohenwicheln in northern Germany, one of the most sophisticated early settlements ever discovered, shows clear evidence of this phenomenon. The site contains elaborate wooden structures with complex floor plans, specialized work areas, and storage systems that represent thousands of hours of skilled labor. But the final occupation layers tell a different story. Tools were carefully packed away, valuable materials were removed, The buildings were systematically dismantled, with useful timber and stones carried away for use elsewhere. This wasn't abandonment. This was conscious deconstruction. The people who had spent generations building this settlement had decided, for reasons we can only guess at, that it was time to move on. They were choosing mobility over permanence, flexibility over stability. And they weren't alone. Across post-glacial Europe, the archaeological record shows wave after wave of settlement and abandonment, construction and deconstruction. Communities would invest decades in building permanent settlements, only to pack up and return to nomadic lifestyles. Others would maintain their settlements for centuries, then suddenly shift to completely different architectural styles and construction techniques, as if they were starting over from scratch. This pattern suggests something profound about human nature and our relationship with permanence. Even when we have the knowledge and resources to build lasting structures, even when permanent settlements offer clear advantages in terms of comfort and security, we remain fundamentally restless creatures. The urge to move, to explore, to try new approaches never completely disappears. But there's another interpretation. Maybe these early builders understood something about permanence that we've forgotten. Maybe they knew that true resilience comes not from building structures that last forever, but from maintaining the ability to adapt, to change, to start over when circumstances require it. The people who abandoned Hohenwicheln didn't lose the knowledge they had gained from building it. They carried that knowledge with them, along with their tools and their portable possessions. When they established new settlements, they could apply everything they had learned, creating better buildings and more efficient communities. The abandonment wasn't a failure, it was an upgrade. This perspective helps explain one of the most puzzling aspects of post-glacial settlement patterns: the incredible diversity of architectural styles and construction techniques that emerged during this period. Instead of seeing gradual evolution from simple to complex structures, we see constant experimentation, innovation, and reinvention. In the river valleys of Central Europe, people were building rectangular houses with sophisticated post and beam construction. In the coastal regions of Scandinavia, they were creating circular pit houses that were partially underground. In the highlands of Scotland, they were constructing stone roundhouses that could withstand hurricane-force winds. Each region, each community, each generation was trying new approaches, testing different solutions to the fundamental challenge of creating human-friendly spaces in a natural world. But perhaps the most remarkable experiments were happening in the areas where different architectural traditions met and mingled. At sites along major rivers and trade routes, archaeologists have found buildings that combine elements from multiple construction traditions: rectangular floor plans with circular hearths, stone foundations supporting wooden superstructures, underground storage areas connected to above-ground living spaces. These hybrid structures represent something extraordinary: communities that were consciously borrowing ideas from their neighbours, testing different approaches, and creating new solutions that were better than anything that had existed before. They were engaged in a kind of architectural dialogue, a conversation conducted in wood and stone that spanned continents and centuries, and this dialogue was accelerating. As trade networks expanded and communities became more interconnected, innovations could spread rapidly across vast distances. A new type of hearth design, developed in one valley, could appear in settlements hundreds of miles away within a few generations. Construction techniques that had evolved in forest environments were adapted for use in grasslands and coastal regions. But the most significant innovations weren't in individual building techniques. They were in the organization of space itself. As communities grew larger and more complex, their builders had to solve entirely new problems. How do you arrange buildings to maximize privacy while maintaining community cohesion? How do you manage water drainage in a settlement with dozens of structures? How do you create spaces that can serve multiple functions as community needs change? The solutions they developed were remarkably sophisticated. At sites like Lepensky Vir, we see evidence of master planning that rivals modern urban design. Buildings were positioned to take advantage of natural drainage patterns while maintaining optimal access to shared resources. Pathways were designed to facilitate movement while creating natural gathering spaces. Even the orientation of individual structures was carefully planned to maximize solar heating in winter while providing shade and cooling in summer. But they were also thinking about time in ways that their Ice Age ancestors never had to consider. Permanent settlements exist not just in space but in time. They have histories, trajectories, futures that extend beyond the lifetimes of their original builders. The people who created these early settlements had to think about how their communities would grow and change over decades or even centuries. Archaeological evidence shows that they were remarkably successful at this kind of long-term planning. Many settlements show clear evidence of phased construction, with buildings added in logical sequences that suggest careful consideration of future needs. Storage areas were positioned to allow for expansion. Pathways were designed to accommodate additional structures. Even the placement of burial areas suggests that planners were thinking about how their communities would evolve over multiple generations. But they were also preparing for failure. At site after site, archaeologists have found evidence of what can only be called contingency planning. Valuable materials were cached in hidden locations. Important tools were distributed among multiple households to prevent total loss if individual structures were destroyed. Knowledge was deliberately redundant, with multiple community members maintaining expertise in critical skills. This wasn't paranoia. This was wisdom born from generations of experience with the fundamental uncertainty of human existence. Even the most permanent settlement could be destroyed by fire, flood, or conflict. Even the most stable community could be disrupted by environmental change or social upheaval. The builders of these early settlements understood that true security came not from building indestructible structures, but from maintaining the ability to rebuild when destruction inevitably came. And destruction did come. The archaeological record is littered with evidence of settlements that were burned, flooded, or simply overwhelmed by environmental changes they couldn't adapt to quickly enough. But what's remarkable is how often these disasters led not to abandonment, but to reconstruction. Communities would rebuild on the same sites, often incorporating lessons learned from the previous failure. They would improve their drainage systems after floods, space their buildings farther apart after fires, develop new construction techniques after earthquakes. This pattern of destruction and reconstruction created a kind of evolutionary pressure that drove rapid innovation in building techniques and community organization. The settlements that survived were those that learned fastest, adapted most effectively, and maintained the greatest flexibility in the face of changing circumstances. But survival wasn't just about technical innovation, it was also about social cohesion. The communities that thrived were those that developed effective mechanisms for making collective decisions, resolving conflicts, and coordinating the labor necessary for major construction projects. They had to learn to work together, not just for weeks or months, but for years and decades. This required new forms of leadership, new systems of authority, and new ways of organizing human relationships. The informal consensus building that worked for small nomadic bands wasn't sufficient for managing the complex social dynamics of permanent settlements with hundreds of inhabitants. Archaeological evidence suggests that different communities experimented with different approaches to these challenges. Some developed hierarchical leadership structures with clear chains of command. Others maintained more egalitarian systems, but created specialized roles for coordinating different aspects of community life. Still others seemed to rotate leadership responsibilities among different individuals or families, preventing any single person or group from accumulating too much power. But regardless of their specific organizational structures, all successful permanent settlements had to solve the same fundamental problem: how to balance individual autonomy with collective responsibility. People needed enough freedom to pursue their own interests and develop their own skills, but they also needed to contribute to the common good in ways that maintained the viability of the entire community. The solutions they developed were often elegant in their simplicity: shared work projects that rotated among different families, common areas that everyone helped maintain, resource-sharing systems that ensured no one went without basic necessities, while still rewarding individual effort and skill. But perhaps most importantly, they developed cultural practices that reinforced community solidarity, festivals and ceremonies that brought everyone together regardless of their individual status or specialization, storytelling traditions that preserved and transmitted the shared history of the settlement, artistic traditions that expressed collective identity through decorative elements incorporated into buildings and public spaces. These cultural innovations were just as important as their technical achievements, because permanent settlements weren't just about creating better physical shelter. They were about creating new forms of human community, new ways of living together that could support larger populations and more complex social relationships than had ever existed before. And they were laying the groundwork for even more ambitious experiments. As their settlements grew larger and their trade networks more extensive, as their technologies became more sophisticated and their social organizations more complex, they were creating the conditions that would eventually make possible the development of agriculture, cities, and all the other innovations that would define human civilization. But that transformation was still thousands of years in the future. For now, it was enough that they had solved the fundamental challenge of permanent habitation. They had learned to create lasting human spaces that could serve as foundations for community life. They had built the first true architecture, structures designed not just for immediate shelter, but for the long-term support of human society. And they had done it without sacrificing the essential human qualities that had made survival possible in the first place. They remained adaptable, innovative, and resilient. They maintained their deep understanding of natural materials and environmental processes. They preserved their ability to work together effectively under challenging circumstances. What they had added was the capacity for permanence, the ability to create structures and communities that could outlast their individual creators, the knowledge of how to build not just for today, but for tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. They had become architects of human space in the fullest sense of that term, masters of both temporary and permanent construction, builders who could create effective shelter under any circumstances, whether they had minutes or years to work with, whether they were planning for a single night or multiple generations. And they were teaching us something important about the nature of home itself, that it's not really about the physical structure, as impressive as their buildings were. It's about the human relationships and cultural practices that give meaning to physical space. It's about the stories we tell, the memories we preserve, the futures we imagine together. The people who built these early settlements understood that home is both a place and a process, a physical location that provides shelter and security, but also an ongoing project of community building that requires constant attention and care. They knew that the most beautiful building in the world is just an empty shell without the human presence that brings it to life. And they knew that even the most permanent structure is ultimately temporary, that all human creations are subject to the forces of time and change. That true permanence lies not in any individual building or settlement, but in the knowledge and skills and cultural traditions that allow humans to create new homes wherever they find themselves. This was perhaps their greatest gift to us, the understanding that we can be both rooted and mobile, both permanent and adaptable. That we can create lasting structures without becoming prisoners of those structures. That we can build homes that endure while maintaining the freedom to leave them behind when circumstances require it. They had learned to inhabit the world as both nomads and settlers, carrying their true home not in any physical structure, but in their knowledge, their relationships, and their shared capacity to create human space wherever they chose to make their stand. This wisdom lives on in us still. Every time you set up a tent in the wilderness, every time you arrange furniture in a new apartment, every time you create a cozy corner in a busy cafe, you're channeling the same fundamental human drive that motivated those Ice Age builders, the desire to transform raw space into human space, to create shelter that's not just about protection, but about belonging. And maybe that's what we've lost sight of in our modern world, of permanent addresses and mortgage payments and structures designed to last centuries. We've forgotten that the most important thing about any shelter isn't how long it will stand, but how well it serves the people who inhabit it, how effectively it creates the conditions for human flourishing, for community, for the kind of deep satisfaction that comes from knowing you have a place in the world. Our ancestors understood this intuitively. They built for human scale, for human needs, for the rhythms of human life. Their shelters were extensions of their bodies, responsive to their movements, adaptable to their changing circumstances. They didn't try to impose their will on the landscape. They listened to what the land was offering and worked with those offerings to create something beautiful and functional and deeply satisfying. We can see echoes of this wisdom in the architecture that moves us most deeply. The Japanese tea house that seems to grow naturally from its garden setting. The Mediterranean courtyard that creates perfect microclimates for both solitude and gathering. The Scandinavian cabin that embraces the forest while providing warm refuge from the cold. These structures succeed not because they're the biggest or the most expensive or the most technologically advanced, but because they understand something fundamental about the relationship between humans and the spaces they inhabit. But perhaps the most profound lesson from our journey through 20,000 years of shelter evolution is this: that home is not a destination, but a practice. Not a place you arrive at once and stay forever, but a skill you develop and refine throughout your life. The ability to create human space wherever you find yourself, to transform any environment into a place where you can rest, create, connect with others, and remember who you are. The mammoth bone house builders knew this. The forest shelter craftsmen knew this. The cave dwellers and the early settlement planners and the nomads who chose to become settlers all knew this. They understood that the external structure was just the beginning, that the real work of creating home happened in the daily practices of living together, sharing resources, making decisions, resolving conflicts, and building the kind of trust that allows people to be vulnerable with each other in small enclosed spaces. They knew that home is made not just of materials, but of memories. Not just of walls, but of the conversations that happen within those walls. Not just of roofs, but of the dreams that unfold beneath those roofs. They built with their hands, but they created homes with their hearts, their attention, their commitment to each other's well-being. And they understood something else, that we're still learning, that the best shelters are the ones that help us become more fully ourselves. Spaces that support our need for both solitude and community. Structures that protect us from the elements, while keeping us connected to the natural world. Homes that provide security without becoming prisons, permanence without rigidity, beauty without ostentation. This is why their story matters. Not because we need to return to mammoth bone houses or forest lean-tos, but because we need to remember what they knew about the relationship between humans and the spaces we inhabit. We need to reclaim their understanding of shelter as a fundamentally creative act, a form of collaboration between human ingenuity and natural materials, between individual needs and community requirements. We need to remember that every shelter, from the most temporary to the most permanent, is an expression of hope. Hope that tomorrow will come. Hope that we can create conditions that support not just survival, but flourishing. Hope that the work we do today will serve the people we love, both now and in the future. The people who lived 20,000 years ago faced challenges we can barely imagine. Temperatures that would kill us in minutes, predators that could tear us apart, landscapes that changed so quickly that the survival strategies of one generation might be useless to the next. And yet they didn't just survive, they created beauty, they developed technologies, they built communities that lasted for centuries. They did this not because they were superhuman, but because they understood something essential about what it means to be human. That we are creatures who make meaning through making things, who create identity through creating spaces, who build relationships through building shelters together. They knew that every act of construction is also an act of imagination. Every shelter is a bet on the future, a statement of faith that life is worth protecting and nurturing and celebrating. Every home, no matter how humble, is a declaration that humans deserve spaces designed for their comfort, their safety, their capacity for joy. And they knew that the work is never finished, that every shelter requires maintenance, every community needs tending, every home must be constantly renewed through the daily practices of care and attention and love. They built not just for themselves, but for their children and their children's children. They created structures that could evolve, communities that could adapt, traditions that could survive, even when the original buildings crumbled back into the earth. This is their legacy, not any particular building or technique or material, but the understanding that humans have the capacity to create homes anywhere, under any circumstances, if we're willing to pay attention to what the land offers and what our communities need. If we're willing to work together, to share knowledge, to experiment and adapt and rebuild when necessary. They remind us that home is both the most basic and the most sophisticated of human achievements. Basic because shelter is a fundamental survival need, as essential as food or water. Sophisticated because creating true homes requires not just technical skill, but emotional intelligence, social awareness, aesthetic sensitivity, and the kind of long-term thinking that can imagine not just what we need today, but what future generations might need as well. The story of shelter is the story of human creativity in the face of uncertainty, of ingenuity born from necessity, of communities formed through shared vulnerability and mutual dependence. It's the story of how we learn to transform the raw materials of the world into spaces that nurture the best of human nature, while protecting us from the worst of natural forces. But it's also the story of how we learned to be at home in the world itself, how we developed the skills and knowledge and cultural practices that allow us to thrive in any environment, under any conditions. How we became a species capable of making ourselves at home on every continent, in every climate, in circumstances our ancestors could never have imagined. The shelters they built are long gone now, returned to the earth from which they came, but the knowledge they developed, the skills they perfected, the wisdom they accumulated about how to create human-friendly spaces in an often inhuman world, that knowledge lives on. In every building we construct, every room we arrange, every space we inhabit with intention and care. And perhaps most importantly, it lives on in our capacity to recognize that we are still the same species that once huddled around fires in mammoth bone houses, still the same creatures who need shelter not just from the wind and rain, but from the loneliness and uncertainty that can make even the most comfortable physical spaces feel empty and cold. We are still builders, still shelter seekers, still creatures who make meaning through making homes. The materials have changed, the techniques have evolved, but the fundamental human drive remains the same. the desire to create spaces where we can be safe, be ourselves, be together. This is what our ancestors gave us, not just the knowledge of how to build, but the understanding of why we build. Not just techniques for creating shelter, but wisdom about what makes a shelter into a home. They remind us that the most important architecture happens not in the grand gestures of monuments and skyscrapers, but in the intimate spaces where daily life unfolds. In the careful attention to human scale, human need, human longing, they built the first homes, and in doing so, they built us. So tonight, as you return to your own shelter, as you flip that switch and lock that door and settle into the space you call home, remember them. Remember the long journey that brought us from caves to houses, from desperate survival to comfortable security. Remember that your home, however modern, however removed from the ancient world of our ancestors, is still part of the same great human project they began so long ago, the project of creating spaces where humans can flourish, where we can rest and dream and love and create, where we can be vulnerable and strong, individual and connected, rooted and free, where we can remember who we are and imagine who we might become. This is the true revolution of shelter. Not the invention of any particular technique or material, but the discovery that we have the capacity to make ourselves at home anywhere in the world. That home is not a place we find, but a condition we create. Not a destination we reach, but a practice we perfect, one day at a time, one small act of care and attention at a time. The mammoth bone houses are gone. The forest shelters have returned to the earth. The early settlements lie buried beneath the accumulation of centuries. But the homes they made possible surround us still. In every room where people gather, in every space designed for human comfort, in every structure that shelters not just our bodies, but our dreams, they built the first homes. We are still building them, and as long as humans exist, we always will be. Because that's what we do. That's who we are, creatures who make meaning through making shelter, who create identity through creating space, who build homes not just for protection, but for the sheer human joy of having a place to call our own. Home. It's the oldest human invention, and the newest one too. As ancient as the first fire and as fresh as tomorrow's blueprint, as simple as four walls and a roof, and as complex as all the relationships and memories and dreams that give those walls their meaning. Our ancestors knew this, and now so do we.